Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming, for being here physically. It's a pleasure to welcome Eyal Weizman. It's the first and only physical lecture this term. This term's topic, it's about research cultures, and if there's any name or agency which comes to mind, then it's forensic architecture. So we are really delighted having you here tonight. Kaiho Yu and Maya Oswaldek curated this Sliver lecture and the topic, and Kaiho, you will properly introduce Eyal. I just want to give some thoughts like that. I think forensic architecture has been at the forefront on inventing a new reading of architecture, and which is research-based, which is investigative, which is applied, and which is of like architecture or architectural evidence. Architecture is evidence. It's architecture as a device. It's a spatial and temporal approach of investigation, and it's also a lot about tools, and it's fantastic to also see the development over the last decade, how you changed tools, and I'm really looking forward to hear more tonight. I also encourage everyone who doesn't know the website of forensic architecture to look at that. It's one of the best structured pages existing. And I hand over to you, Kaiho, now, and looking forward to this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for doing the welcome and open the lecture. So everyone, I'm glad to introduce forensic architecture and Eyal Weizman for tonight's lecture. Forensic architecture is a research agency based at Goldsmiths University of London. It is a group of architects, artists, filmmakers, journalists, software engineers, lawyers. They work together in a variety of projects. Funded in 2010 by Eyal Weizman, our speaker tonight, forensic architecture is committed to the development and for the new technology to look into the evidence and undertake advanced architecture and media investigation on behalf of international prosecutors, human rights and civil society groups, as well as political and environmental justice organizations, including the UN, Human Rights Watch, Israeli Information Center for Human Rights, etc. So for me, my first encounter with forensic architecture's work was at New York at the 2019 Whitney Biennale, where they presented an investigation on tear gas grenades being used along San Diego-Tijuana border in November 2018, pointing out the relationship of the grenades to the provider Warren Kanders, the CEO of Safariland Group, and back then the vice chair of the board of trustees of Whitney Museum. In the video installation, forensic architecture looked into the evidence of triple chaser by constructing the digital models, placing the rendering of the model on pattern background and photorealistic renderings. They trained the computer to classify one of Safariland's triple chaser in search for evidence. Having out tonight at IOA, I think the most fascinating part for us is to hear how, by rejecting the traditional professional practice, him and his team are able to use the field of architecture by dealing with building surveys, maps, models, animations, videos, and text to build up a model theory in which methodological tools and concepts to test against unfolding global events and make the findings legible in public political forums, as well as their website, far removed from both architectural studios and the academic house. So we have this very nice setting here. Without further ado, let's welcome Eyal Weizman tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kaiho. Thank you, Berbel. I feel like I'm coming back home because, in fact, my first job ever was here at the Angewandte Kunst. I think it was 98 or so. 1999. So it's amazing, and it feels really like coming back home. And I'm very happy with this invitation, very happy to come back here. And after a long time that I haven't been here, speak about the work that was developed in London, but also in many other places. Today I want to speak about clouds. And clouds are kind of a challenge both for forensics and for architecture. So I'm not going to define exactly what forensic architecture is, but it will become clearer in this investigation, or in this presentation rather, what are we doing, how are we organizing, so how we think politically about various dilemmas between media, law, politics, and accountability. But I started by saying that clouds are a kind of a limit concept of an object. Forensics, whether the forensics pathology of a body, alive or dead, or whether any other form of forensics, is about traces left in a material world, and for us very much in a built world. So in forensic architecture, you need to rely on some kind of understanding of what architecture is, that comes to be analyzed, comes to be presented, comes as a kind of vehicle of accountability. And clouds are challenging the very foundations of our own sort of methods and ways of thinking. I want to start with this image, which is a bit unclear, in a story that began in 2008. At that time, I think many of you know that I originally come from Israel and developed, and in fact the origin Israel-Palestine. I was in London and I had a kind of a strange job. I was asked by Israeli-based human rights groups to call into Gaza. 2008 was a big bombing, very devastating bombing of Gaza. And those groups cannot call Gaza directly from Israel, because if you were caught with an Israeli dialing code in Gaza under bombardment, people would legitimately think that you are informing perhaps the enemy. So all the calls went through London, all the calls went through me, and I was asked to simply go down the list and see that people were okay. And I was calling many people, and one of the person that I was calling just had their house bombed, destroyed. And he told me something that I can never forget. It moved me so deeply. He said, "My building has turned from solid into gas. I'm breathing in my home." And I understood that those clouds, bomb clouds in this case, are actually architecture in gaseous form. Why are they architecture? Because a bomb cloud contains everything a building is made of. A bomb cloud is basically vapor, sort of gaseous water that carries with it dust, and that dust is made of everything that the building was. So it has the majority of the proportion of what's in the cloud of a bomb is concrete, but then you have a lot of plaster, you have some wood, you have some glass, you have curtains or cloth, if you had something, you have anything that you had perhaps in your bathroom, drugs, etc., is pulverized together. Sometimes people are destroyed and killed in those bombing, and fragments of their body also exist within that cloud. And it kind of stays up in the air for about 8 to 10 minutes and is continuously morphing. But to think of them as architecture, to think of that as a building, a temporary building, a 10 minutes long building that is continuously morphing, has become a very important starting point for one of our first investigations that was conducted of another cycle of bombing in Gaza back in 2014, where we were looking to enter the Gaza Strip. We were working with Amnesty International at the time, and we were denied entry. Just as any one of our investigation is based on denied entry to the crime scene. You know that forensic specialists are state forensic specialists. Forensics as the art of the state is based on designating out the crime scene. The first thing that happens when a crime takes place is that a cordon is being put up, and a cordon designates a certain site of exception, right? It's taken out of the normal routine operation of the city, and it is designated as an exclusive area for state agents. Only state agents are allowed to slip under the cordon into the crime scene. In fact, if you are on civilian clothes, say some kind of Verfassungsschutz or FBI, you have to show a card, and you know that from the film, no? You show your FBI card and you slip under the cordon and you come in. When you undertake what we call ourselves counter-forensics, you're always outside of the crime scene. You need to rely on other information. Something needs to leak out for you to undertake your investigations. And of course, if you are in counter-forensics, i.e. if you're looking at the crimes of states, of police, of militaries, of secret services, the control of the scene of the crime is the main tool for the state to cover up for what they do. So there is no surprise that when Israel bombed the Gaza Strip, the walls around Gaza became that cordon and nobody could come in. Nobody that was investigating crimes could come in. So what comes out of the cordoned off area? Very often it's videos. And you have videos, sometimes 100, and in this case thousands of videos that we were collecting from one day. We wanted to research August 1st, 2014, one day during the war in Gaza. And the problem of videos that you pick up from online sources, what is called open source research, information that is out there for everybody to see but that nobody looks at, is that the internet platform that posts them obviously always remove the metadata. So you don't know where and you don't know when the photograph or the video was taken. What you need to do is a very basic thing. You need to start creating a timeline and you need to figure out where in Gaza, in this case Rafah, the southernmost city of Gaza, we are talking about. And to do that, you need to find what we call physical clocks. Physical clocks are physical analog description of time. Sometimes we have shadows. Shadows are good physical clocks. They can tell you if you know you have basic architectural software that simulate the sun in particular place at in particular time. And if you match them, you know exactly the time, or within 5 minutes margin of error, you can know what time a photograph was taken. But long shots don't have usable shadows. And then we realized that actually what we needed to do was not to look at the ground, but it took us about 4 months to realize that. What we needed to look at was the sky, and what we needed to map was a transformation of clouds, and in this case bomb clouds, in the sky. So when you have 3 videos taken by 3 different people that don't know each other from 3 different perspectives, of the same cloud, and you know it by measuring it, or sometimes by building models of it, you know that you have the same moment in time. And if you have different perspective on the clouds, you can also start calculating the where exactly are the photographers. So you create something that we call the cloud atlas, classification based on thousands of images of cloud shapes. All clouds get a name or a catalog number, and we start to match them up, and then we know what time they are, but we don't know what time it is. But we know this has happened at the same time. Looking very carefully at the evolution and working together with experts on understanding the evolution of a bomb cloud, how it rises up as a column, arrives at a certain altitude where pressure align, opens into an umbrella or a mushroom, fall onto itself, and then dissipates. That's the life cycle of a bomb cloud. The image on the right are images that we received from the medical services in Gaza. These are usually not even like ambulances as you think of it, but kind of tuk-tuks or scooters with very brave first responders that drive directly into bomb clouds. All communication is obviously interrupted, so those medical service people see a bomb cloud and drive into it. And they usually have a video at the top of this scooter, so that's very important information. And we've seen in one of those, we've seen 3 clouds, and then we see them in another place, and we understand these are the same clouds. But we see also that the gap between this one, and this one is smaller on the right than it is on the left. And then from this you can start calculating the difference in location. So that, syncing up cloud is a month-long process of looking at almost every image has a bit of sky. Every bit of sky has some cloud in it, and we can start mapping it out. But we didn't have an anchor. We didn't have one time that we knew that bomb blew up in that one time, and then we could have triangulated outwards from that. Only that very much later, a European satellite, American satellites would not fly and provide images of Israeli actions during war, but the European satellite did. And it went once over Gaza that day, and we took that shot, and this shot had, by chance, a bomb just exploded at this moment. So the chase was to see which one of the clouds that we see in elevation is this cloud in plan. And we were waiting and looking for many, and then finally through measuring and perspective we find that this is the one. And now we all of a sudden have an anchor that allows us to locate every cloud with time, because we managed to kind of triangulate outwards. So that is like our Rosetta Stone, a kind of translation system between digital time and cloud shape. And that allowed us to create a timeline that relies on, effectively, we're not even looking at what's happening on the ground, we're only looking at the sky. We create a timeline. By this scratch, we know that this is the same camera. And we are starting to have a picture of what happened in Gaza during that day. Some images come from TV, some come from activists, some come from people and what they're posting online. Sometimes you don't have an exact, and you have a kind of a range of options. Then the next thing to do is the question of of where. You need to build architectural models as navigational tools to create what we call the architectural image complex, a navigational way of moving between images. Simply looking at videos is perhaps entertaining, perhaps it gives you a kind of a trophy, a good shot that you can use on TV, etc. But you need to understand the relation between a huge multiplicity of images. The only way to do it is through architecture. You build an architectural model. We build a full architectural model of the entire city. Didn't exist on OpenStreetMap or anything like that. We had to produce it. And then you can actually match every photograph in space, and you can navigate between one video perspective and the other. This is a bomb that is blasted next to a hospital in Rafah. and a confirmation indeed that the hospital was, or an area close to it, working with fluid dynamic simulation and understanding that's the same cloud in an earlier time. And sometimes you can even see really heartbreaking moments like this, where you in one still frame you see actually the bomb that would blast, kind of like just a fraction of a second. Here it is before it hits the ground. So you know, that bomb would have killed later 16 people, a member of a single family. And you catch it in mid-flight. And that's another thing you can do with architecture. Those of you that read Arabic know that this is, what he's saying here is resistance press. So this is taken probably by Hamas. But be that as it may, it captures the bomb. And the lawyers that we were working with said, can you tell from that one still frame, a 1/24th of a second capture of that bomb, how big it is, what bomb it is, who is the manufacturer? There's about 32 pixels in this bomb, and it's really complicated. But what you need to do is effectively, again, build it into an architectural space and put that plane. We know where the bombs hit, so we know how far away from the camera they are. So we know the plane within the cone of vision where they are, and we can put a grid behind that image, and we can start measuring the bombs, and then we can look in a catalog and find the exact bomb that it was, and then lawyers can move to put all sorts of claims against the manufacturers of these bombs later on. So cloud studies is important for us because they also have a history. And that entire system of creating a cloud atlas is something that did not come from a scientific or from a kind of a existing research methodology. It came from the history of art. And our institute is based in a university, Goldsmiths. It has both a very famous art school and also art history. And in fact, strangely, we are affiliated to what is called the Department of Visual Cultures, so, you know, effectively art historians of sorts. And we started to look at the way in which clouds pose the problem in the history of art. And there's a lot of literature about that, a lot of critical and theoretical literature, Hubert Damisch being one of those, that kind of look at the problem of clouds and cloud representation as a certain limit concept of painting in the 19th century. Of course, cloud studies and also meteorology as a discipline emerged, and this is something that, again, that is important for us, through a collaboration between artists and scientists. Together, people like Constable and scientists like Luke Howard were actually working together to create, to try to understand the other types. How do clouds morph and change? The problem of clouds was always that it's changing faster than the speed of the hand could capture it. By the time you paint it, it's gone. It needs to be imagined, not only described. And therefore, that kind of, the 19th century is full of all sorts of treatises on clouds and all sorts of systems. This is from the young John Ruskin of modern painters, in describing kind of an attempt, almost a desperate attempt, to capture that which cannot be captured. Understanding it could not be captured, but still attempting to do so. In a sense, and that's in Hubert Damisch's work, you have this kind of paradox that by looking at landscape paintings, 16th, 17th century also, you have a strange phenomena by which the ground, the earth, is already in modernity. It's perspectival, it's measured, it's almost cartographic in its logic, whereas the sky is still in the Middle Ages, in a sense that it's divinity, that it's mood, it's ambient, etc. The later Ruskin actually published another treatise on clouds, the storm cloud of the 19th century, a text that is very often referred to as one of the very important texts about the Anthropocene, because it says the sky is lost, the clouds as we knew them are no longer there, the clouds that we are actually describing are political, the clouds are labor and exploitation and coal and child labor, etc. So that is something, again, a kind of a way for us to look at both art history and things to do very practical investigations. But cloud for us are always two things. Clouds are to be seen from the outside, almost as an object, although they are the epitome of metamorphosis and transformation. But they're also an environment. They're an optical kind of milieu that distort vision. It's always something that is both experienced and as what surrounds you and exists in an object. It's those two things, and you need to think of it continuously as those two things. This still is actually a frame from a study that we've done with survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire in London. For those of you that don't know, in 2017 a tower has burned, 72 people died, and many others lost their property and their livelihood as a response to that. We're working with a group of 800 survivors and bereaved families and their lawyers to try to reconstruct what happened there. And very often, memory of the most traumatic moment in people's life, and unfortunately in our work we are in touch very often with trauma, forget or are protected by their memory not to relive those very traumatic moments. People remember very well what happened before the fire, what happened after. But that moment is very difficult to capture. And a very careful and systematic working together with forensic psychologists and the people that are actually very close to the survivors allowed us to reconstruct, build together with people their home, the way it was, try to simulate their vision at that moment in order to understand exactly, sometimes to understand very practical things. I'll show you how it works and how clouds became an important vehicle into memory. So this is just a moment where the door opens and somebody is asked to leave their flat into the darkness of the fog there. Oops. There is no sound. Ausgesteckt. Yeah, it's here.
The door, it was much more of a haze rather than I could see everything, I could see the light and everything, but it was in this section here, this corridor.
So you saw before that he is actually choosing the consistency of cloud as a kind of, and then enters into the space of memory through that moment of distortion.
You know, the area around here. Then I kind of closed the door and opened the door and I kind of stuck my head out, said, hello, hello. Nobody was like really there. And then the smoke comes into the corridor and everything. But after I closed the door, it was much more of a haze rather than I could see everything, I could see the light and everything. But it was in this section here, this corridor.
To show people what happened. This is actually a vehicle, an interviewing vehicle with survivors. And then he has managed to recall, I remember coming down one part and moment in his life.
First of all, I thought there must be a hose pipe, a water hose pipe, because I stepped on something. You know, there's bodies in the.
Sorry, take your time.
you know, but I thought I stepped on like hose pipes in the stairwell. But you know, you can't see. I didn't see anybody. I didn't hear anybody else. You know, but you know, you stepped on somebody else. I just thought it was originally was a water pipe.
Yeah, like a hose pipe or something.
Like a hose pipe coming up the stairwell. I don't know. I don't think there was. No.
So at that moment he realized that what he thought he was stepping on a hose pipe, he was actually stepping on bodies, and that, you know, that kind of moment of trauma was unavailable when asked directly, but has been kind of achieved through the model. Another cloud, maybe more familiar, but back home now again, the West Bank, Nabi Saleh, where there are continuous protests. The Israeli soldiers are by the road. You can see them. It's a beautiful spring day. And there's a little cloud there. That cloud is just one grenade of tear gas. Protesters, I think many of you probably have experience with that. You need to go through the tear gas cloud close to the police or the military to confront them. And they try to create that wall of tear gas so you don't do that. So sometimes you need to run through that cloud. And on this occasion, we were running towards the soldiers. One of them the officer notices us, and this guy is actually shooting at me, at another young activist right next to me, who gets hit with a tear gas grenade in the head. And just to understand that tear gas is also a projectile that is used and abused very often as a weapon. But I recall that when we started to work many years later on tear gas, and indeed, Kaiho, you mentioned Triple Chaser, that was made by the same manufacturer that later paid for our exhibition at the Whitney. But let's start again. The idea of tear gas. This is, I think this is in Taksim. I think this footage is from Turkey, from Istanbul. One of the protests there. Intoxicating the air. The state make the air unbreathable, so that to break the proximity of bodies in space, which is what protests are. I've written a book a few years ago called The Roundabout Revolution, which was really about, I was asking myself I was just wondering about this bizarre coincidence that many of the protests of the Arab Spring, in fact, I think all of them, had their main point, the center point, in roundabouts. I was asking why the roundabout in Tahrir, why in Taksim, why the Manama roundabout, why it always happened around them, and kind of understood that in many cases these are like acupunctural node that you could paralyze a city by taking over a roundabout. You don't need to, it's like you put a city under siege with one pressure point. Because you send shock waves in traffic, etc. And that roundabout revolution was answered very much with toxic fumes. Here in Manama, Bahrain, with burning, with fire, rather than tear gas. But here you see, all the roundabouts that were activated during that time, and the way that they are answered to. Here, very recently, the December 2019, the most tear-gassed day in Chile. We were working with activists on mapping out the quantities of tear gas that the state have pushed into the main square, Plaza de la Dignidad, in the center of Chile. Also creating automatic system to identify and track those things and give a certain shape to them Sometimes the kind of imagination of the cloud, the creation of the form of the cloud is very important, because you need to see how the architecture, the amorphous architecture of the cloud interact with the static architecture of the city. So sometimes it's a question of paint on canvas, sometimes it's a question of mathematical simulation. But here is what Koyo mentioned before. Having worked on all that, we are invited to the Whitney Biennale, and they want to see our work on police violence. We do a lot of work on police killing or murder of people, usually racialized people, under the split-second argument, and that was what we were invited to do. And then started protests organized by a group of activists that we know well called Decolonize This Place, who pointed out that that in fact the vice chair of the Whitney board, a man called Warren B. Kanders, was owning and profiting from a company producing tear gas, the same tear gas I recalled that hit the activist next to me in Palestine. And here you see, the sort of barbed wire here on the right is the US-American border in San Diego, Tijuana, between San Diego and Tijuana. And you see how the tear gas cloud does not obey sovereign borders. It is kind of amorphous. It challenges that sort of division of states in that way. And this is the tear gas and the exposure of it. I'll actually play...
Forensic architecture is training a machine...
I'll speak over it. Otherwise, it's David Byron from Talking Head that did the voiceover for that. But I think you want to hear maybe me now. But I would like to hear David Byron. So actually, we were trying to look for those triple chaser canisters, and we realized that the difference, if you want to create accountability to something that is defined legally as less than legal weapons, no? So, less than lethal, not unlethal, less than lethal, or less lethal weapons. When you sell them internationally, you don't need the same level of permission that you need for selling, I don't know, aircrafts or tanks or guns. That's all on a public record. So to figure out where he sells his tear gas, where the company sells the tear gas, you need to look online. You need to look at the photographs that activists are taking of those tear gas canisters to see, okay, we have them in Sri Lanka, or we have them in Costa Rica, or in other places. And then you can create a map. But it took a long time to do that. So we decided to actually train an automatic system to identify them. And the way to do that is by creating a classifier, a machine learning classifier, which is like teaching, it's an analogy of teaching a child how to identify an object. You say to a child, this is a water bottle. And then, I don't know, this looks different, no? But still a water bottle. And that's a water bottle. And even if it's hidden a little bit, it's still a water bottle. And, for a classifier, you usually collect several thousand images, and then you start getting things back, a lot of false positives, but you get things back. But we didn't have enough photographs of that munition. That's called a training set for machine learning. It wasn't big enough to do that. So what we had to do was actually to create synthetic models for it, and you would see how we do that. Firstly, we got in touch with activists here in Tijuana. Somebody finds for us the actual object, so we can measure it, etc. And now my friend, the Palestinian artist Emily Jassir, here in her house, probably the most tear gas art residency in the world, she's filming that same canister, now with a Hebrew text on it. So we create a kind of photogrammetry model, very basic, I think all of you know how to do that. And we look at the catalog, we compare the dimensions, and then we start producing artificial, synthetic, or fake images of that canister, and telling the classifier these are real images, so that it can learn how to identify them when you send the classifier on the web, or as you say, in the wild. So all the permutation of color and then those kind of backdrops that you would see later are important because they allow the classifier to better understand figure and ground, to understand where the edge of the object is. So we downloaded a lot of synthetic patterns in order to let it do that. And located it in different places. And now I'm going to play a sequence that has a little bit of a strobe. So if somebody is photosensitive or has tendency or fear that has tendency to epilepsy, just don't look at it, although it passed all the medical test for this, but still I think it's better not to. We produced this sequence that is both for, it was part of the film that we showed at the Whitney, which was a film for art viewers, for the public, for people, for humans. But it was also a film for another spectator, an algorithmic spectator, because that film is the entire training set that would be necessary. It's a way of encoding a training set. So if I send somebody the film, or you can download it online, you can use it in order to train your own synthetic classifier to identify these objects. Obviously, we enjoyed the kind of the sort of the rhythm and colorfulness of the analytic process that was necessary to do things, and this is part of a growing what we call model zoo, models of different that we make also available on GitHub publicly, of different kind of objects and munitions that are there. We give the objects and all the training set so they could be identified in the wild. And you know, this is how the process works. You write some kind of
after we train our classifier on synthetic images, kind of, we will deploy it to search for real ones,
and then
leveraging tags and keywords.
And then it goes and it basically downloads a lot of, it takes videos, it breaks them down to still images, and then it gives you the still frames and the percentage that it thinks that these things are that kind of gas. So we both showed it inside, but we worked also with the activists outside the museum. I think firstly I need to tell you something about why we show this kind of work in museums. We do, in forensic architecture, we have multiple fora that we approach. In fact, the new organization we've just started in Berlin, a new Verein in Berlin, is called Forensis, which is named after our inaugural exhibition at the HKW Berlin. And forensis, which is the Latin origin of the word forensic in forensic architecture, actually means in Latin that which belongs to the forum. Forensic is to put something to public debate. It's the art of the forum. And for the Roman orators of the first century, of first millennium, first century of the first millennium, it was never, the court was not the only forum. In fact, the forum was the public space of exchange, of economy, of encounter, the public domain of the city, the Roman forum. And for us, it's very important to take forensics outside of its purely legalistic meaning and use. So although we show our work in national and international court cases, although we've led to conviction of some people, we participated we provided evidence for the Golden Dawn trial in Greece that led to the conviction of and dismantling of this Nazi party. In many cases, both in International Criminal Court and in the European Courts of Human Rights, etc., a lot of our work do not go to court, or works that go to court first would later be presented in other fora, such as media, or such as Human Rights Report, or such as, you know, protests, or Citizen Tribunal, or things like that. And very often, also our work, because it's quite visual, and, you know, it speaks to the essence of image, of media, etc., is recently became invited into museums. And it was for us a way to offset the problems of the other forums. So the legal forum is very, very nerdy, it's very narrow. You can say few things. First of all, you need to justify why you dare even to say that. And we encounter a lot of problems because people think we're activists, people, and then now that we started showing in the art world, people call us artists. We came into various paradoxes by which when we show work in the art, sometimes we're criticized, we say this is not art, this is evidence. And then when we show the same work, the art world said it's evidence. In a legal setting, they said, no, that's art, that's not evidence. So obviously it kind of slips across these borders, but every forum allowed you to say something else about a piece of work. The legal forum is very small and narrow. The forms of art and cultural spaces allow you to locate things within a historical and theoretical setting and to open up another level of conversation. So this is why we went there, and we always use the art commission either to fund work that we could no longer fund, to get visibility to cases. It was the first time that we encountered the art space itself being the accused person, the accused of a human rights violation. So we had to speak to the very museum in which we showed. So we both showed it and removed it at some point in collaboration with other activists. And the wonderful thing that happened is that this board member, the deputy head of the board, had to resign. So you have a kind of an effect that you can do also sometimes in the art world, and therefore later he even sold all his tear gas business, which was interesting for us. And yeah, so
Emerges a picture of police
that we did still on with images on tear gas. This is about the Black Lives Matter protests in the US. This is the same slide. Where we looked at enormous amount of videos and started locating them within all sort of creating kind of analysis of that, sort of more like a bigger meta-analysis. I'm going to skip forward because I think we're running out of time. So there's different kinds of clouds that we are using, that we're looking at. Also, those of chemical strikes. Here again in Gaza with white phosphorus that was presented in Geneva in the Human Rights Council. And also understanding that clouds are becoming also epistemological, not only physical, meaning creating a fog of information. Many perpetrators want to both violate human rights and to make violence against people and things, and violence against the evidence that those things have even taken place. And so there's a lot of negation and denial, and sometimes we are able to actually use those negationists to prove the information that they actually provide inadvertently in order to prove our point. This is perhaps the most famous mushroom cloud, small mushroom cloud, in the Syrian civil war. It is in a town called Khan Shaykhun, and it was immediately understood to be a chemical strike. But the Syrians and Russians and many other people online started deflecting and negating that. We've had a very small contribution.
At the time,
to this investigation. Somebody has photographed the crater, and we just made a model of the crater, which allowed Human Rights Watch to measure it, to calculate the size of that bomb, and it contribute to the identification of that as a chemical strike. And then another one happened in Alatimina, and then you had the Russian command actually trying to negate what it is that we were doing. So they were looking at the image and entering into the same debate about the size of the crater. You know, a lot of lies finally kind of become very technical. And then, without noticing, they've provided the holy grail of everyone that is investigating chemical strike in Syria. A cross-section of chemical bombs. Nobody had it before. And they wanted to say, you see, that bomb is too big to make that little crater. So now for the first time, we had drawings. And being architects, you have a drawing, you turn it into a model. So we make a little model, really basic model of that. And we start like archaeologists collecting all sort of traces, all sort of twisted bit of metal that we could find, and wrapping them up, or unwrapping them rather, and trying to construct that bit of old amphora, like you do an old pottery in archaeology. Some of those are diagnostic, and you can actually locate that. That's work we've done with Bellingcat. And you, piece by piece, you could show that the pieces that collaborators found on the ground actually do belong to that bomb and have to be part of that bomb that was provided at this press conference. So piecing it together bit by bit. Another debate about chemical strike had to do with chlorine. The one before was sarin. Chlorine is a kind of a heavy gas that creates a sort of a greenish cloud that goes down and is less lethal than sarin, but it was dropped by the Syrians. The Russian expeditionary force in Syria again wanted to protect them, and a debate started about a single canister. This particular canister that was found on a rooftop in a hall. What we know now is that it was simply industrial chlorine that was thrown out, did that hole in the ground. The chlorine went through the building and poisoned dozens of people in there. But the debate that the Syrians were claiming, the official Assad regime claiming that it was planted evidence that there was no chemical strike at all. And the question became very simple. Has this canister arrived at the site with a force of gravity, or has it arrived against the force of gravity? Did people actually carry it from the ground up and place it? So we've taken all measured analysis of that, and we started looking with those videos that try to negate and deny the truth of that attack, and see what we could learn from them. So firstly, we could see that a corner at the top has already been chipped, and it's sitting in a straight line with a crater. So that pushes toward, it doesn't 100% confirm that this came from the air. If it would come from the air, the only people in the air is the Russian and Syrian Air Force. So if it came by gravity, we know it really was thrown from a Syrian helicopter. So that analysis continues in that way. And then you see all sort of other things. You see a bit of fence, but it's crumpled. And then you can identify all sort of objects within that. And you can uncrump that fence and see that actually it fits We don't know if it stood there, but it fits exactly that dimensions. So that pushes more towards the fact it came with gravity. And then all sort of news reporting saying that's a hoax actually captured that object within the pile of rubble. And then when you uncrump that object, what you get is the kind of harness, same harness that we see in other places used in Syrian chlorine attacks, and fits perfectly the canister. So you'd have to put that on a canister so it falls straight down, and it's kind of an improvised thing. And then you need to really work very, very closely, materially, almost kind of trying to build a texture of that object as close as you can by projecting images onto it. It's almost as if you hold that canister that is actually thousands of miles away from you in your hand and try to see what traces are inscribed onto that surface. It's almost like the canister is itself a photograph that is inscribed with different things, that you need to read this photograph. So initially you have the charring at the top, and we know that is how the nozzle is being removed with a small explosive. And you have other elements within that. So, we compare and we see that kind of charring is something that we see in other places. But the most interesting one was that we noticed that grid, very faint grid imprinted on it. And we thought that might have something to do with the fence. So we had to kind of take the measurement of the fence and see that it fits. So now we could say, okay, now here's another bit of evidence that suggests the canister hit the wall, hit the fence, and got inscribed with it. And we also see the way it is threaded. It is threaded like a fence. So then we look at it more and more and more, and actually we see something strange on this. We see this kind of draining lines. You would see them again, and we know that when canisters are being releasing their chlorine, they get defrosted. They get a frost. They get a frost on them from the differences in pressure. And we start looking at the surface, and we're seeing something very strange. The draining signs are actually pointing upwards. Now, for the way that everybody knows, water drains downwards. Why is that? And of course, the Russian media, some Russian media and some Syrian media was saying that was tampered with. And then we got like really alarm bells, because we saw indeed they were right. The site was tampered with. If you look very carefully at the draining signs, they're pointing upwards. It means somebody has touched the scene, and that is exactly what they were saying. And I think it makes you, things like that, at the end of a process, identifying a trace that shows, that inverts the story and shows that a canister indeed, that particular canister was rotated, that you need to be open to. You need to be open to evidence that contradict your evidence, or contradict what it is that you feel has happened. Now I tell you what I think happened. I think there's many good reasons why a canister could be rotated, but I think that evidence, and especially evidence in war zone, need to be looked at very carefully, and not always the idea of people saying we didn't do it is wrong. Now, I think in this case, it is a chemical strike. I think it's a shameful chemical strike. I think there have been chemical strike there, but I think that our business is really in kind of looking very carefully and analyzing that. We've put that was published via the New York Times, which is now, as you know, as you see probably online, you see that they've kind of taken forensic architectural methodologies and doing a lot of work in that way. So this is this is a Twitter map around the debate around this canister. around this canister. Was it rotated? Was it not rotated? So many people on Twitter. That's a map of a debate, a discourse analysis with nodes, etc. And one of those small nodes is us, really, not the main player here. Another kind of cloud, if you like, that we are working with and on is the digital domain and what we call digital violence. This is our analysis of the surveillance of activists, human rights defenders and journalists all over the world by the same Israeli-made software called Pegasus. We're working with Amnesty and the Citizen Lab on a story that later rolled and became one of the biggest exposure of private surveillance in the world. And effectively, we're applying open source methodologies. This is what we're doing to analyzing digital violence. What does it mean? It means that we are not able to identify, or our technique, it's not what interests us, it's not what we do to take your phone and see whether you have this software called Pegasus on it. What we want to know is how one attack relates to events in a physical world. What happened to you when your phone is under surveillance? What happened to your life? What happened to your mental well-being? What happened to what kind of violence you'd experience in the physical world? How it relates to other people that are being surveyed. What's the logic of, the aggregate logic of those? And so we've kind of been part of the building of a big community of practice of activists from Palestine to India, from Mexico to Rwanda, that have done that work of resisting this kind of surveillance by holding together and really mined a lot of data to create that platform. And you know, we did a lot of work on their corporate structure and how the evolution of the corporate structure of this company relates also to increasing attacks on defenders. This is just kind of a teaser. You should go to see the project online. This is our how the platform works. We map every digital infection. It's blue. So this is, for example, in Mexico, all digital infections, and then in other countries. And then in red, the red dots are consequences that those people experience in the physical world. And this is about those consequences experienced by investigators, all transactions, etc., put in a kind of a three-dimensional database that shows the kind of severity of this type of digital cloud, if you like. I want to end with the last thing, forest fires. This is from our work in Indonesia. We're working with Greenpeace on burning of forests and the kind of toxic cloud that emerge out of these unregulated corporate agriculture that actually burns the forest and peatlands and redesigns the weather in a sense. Remember the kind of storm cloud of the 19th century and Ruskin. And today we are in a sort of, we need to, you know, this territory is here, all the way from Australia, East Timor, to Malaysia, and Sri Lanka here. A cloud exists also on the scale of a street corner when it's thrown at you as tear gas. It exists as a chemical strike on an urban scale. It exists here in a transcontinental one. Those clouds as well, they don't read international borders. They cut across. They have their own architecture, but they create their own political community. They are kind of commons, but negative commons. So it's not the good commons that we think of as mountain, lakes, you know, like, and rivers, skies. This is a condition of common suffocation. And it required the creation of a community of resistance that exists in the shadow of that cloud. And I think that this is one of the kind of biggest challenges for us today, is to look at those forms of violence, to look at the air that we breathe, and to look at its weaponization by corporations and state, and find ever more creative and innovative ways of creating the cloud studies of the 21st century. Thank you.
So I think what we'll do is that we do a quick response, and then we're going to open the floor to the audience if you guys have any questions. You want to take a seat?
Oh, thank you.
So I really like the lecture title, The Cloud Studies, because it kind of composes into a lot of mixed feelings, right? On the one hand, it is very poetic to think about when you first, try to construct the idea of cloud, saying the architecture can be, constructed as cloud. But on the other hand, it's very heartbreaking, because when we talk about cloud, it's not just, the cloud in landscape, but it's the cloud composed by the weapons, right? I think this is like composed into something with multiple layers of the understanding how we perceive to architecture. So if we start with what you showed in the beginning, the analyze of the bomb, the cloud from the bomb, it's super interesting to think that architecture and city, we are no longer using the way we apply to the design, the measurement, the perspective to measure the architecture itself. But we are using architecture as a baseline or the framework to counter kind of construct the cloud or the smoke. So the architecture and the urban environment, they are becoming like a reference for us to reconstruct what is the smoke in the 3D environment. I think that's something also working with how we perceive the technologies. For the development of architecture, first started with the perspectival drawing or measuring of space or the form, and then with the development of technology, we started to see things in different ways, like satellite view, and now with with what you were doing with metadata, we started to see things with multiple, even unhuman vision, and then we are using these kind of ways to think how through the architectural environment, certain things can be, we can start to do a counter-forensic analyze on this. So maybe the first thing I want to discuss with you is that how do you see the traditional tools we are using in architecture being kind of counter-used, being applied to analyze the tangible medium with time and space?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, because it's one that kind of cuts to the core of the way, at least when I studied and when I was a young teacher at the Angewandte, at the Bildende Kunst also, there was this kind of two camps in architecture. There was the parametric camp, science, modeling. I don't know if it's probably gone. It's still around, okay. And then there was the kind of political ones, goodwill, program-based, etc. And, people were not hearing each other. They were not speaking to each other. And a lot of good ideas got lost simply because of this polemic. Obviously I was kind of born into the fight, so I was like, you're in a pub brawl, you take a side, and then, you enter into that. But I learned better. And a lot of the tools that we are using are actually coming from parametric architecture. And somehow nourished by the same theoretical kind of sources, both in philosophy and in the history of science that were interesting there, and were applied in a kind of, maybe not to the way that I would like, or to the way that I understand what young intellectual within architecture should do. And I don't think we should refer to people as architects. No, I mean, this is what we studied. But we're intellectuals. We try to be public intellectual. We try to intervene in the world. I didn't see that happening, and I think that there is a way. Imagine, like that work I was showing to Jeff Kipnis. Maybe the kind of the either the good or the evil of parametricism, and kind of like we had a very interesting discussion about cloud morphology. Okay, so this is about a call for kind of conscious political activist work to actually cross the line to science and to technology, and to understand critical ways of using it. Sometimes fail, but to try to do it like that. I think for me there's another way to engage your question, and that is that I started the work, and Hannes would remember that, when we were, because I just started when I was an assistant with you at the Three Hackers studio. I was just starting my mapping project in the occupied territories in Palestine, and was looking at, trying desperately to convince people around me that there could be a crime done on a drawing board, that you can violate human rights by the way you draw buildings. And a lot of work was then kind of trying to criminalize architecture, or a particular kind of architecture in this context. But then we were using architectural knowledge in order to untangle that. That work needed to be done from architecture to expose architectural complicity. That is to say, it's a field of struggle, architecture. Just like outside, the political field of struggle is now, the kind of the fate of Europe is hanging on a brink with governments like you have here, and we have there, and whatever, and it needs to be fought on every step and on every institution and on every level. So architecture, there's nothing inherently bad or good about it. You need to struggle with the tools that you have, and I guess that for a lot of non-architects, it's very different. When I lecture in non-architectural school, people say, "Oh, such high technology. This looks, like really. Where do you get all this high-tech stuff?" When I lecture in school, well, for you know that. I mean, this is basic. It's like all the technology to do everything. Each one of those investigations exists on all the laptops, or each individual laptop in this room, just need to want to do it, and kind of have the inclination and will and stamina to do that. This is nothing high tech here. I mean, it's the basis of architecture. So I think there is a kind of a struggle that is, with architecture towards the external world, but a struggle for architecture, and for doing, I think, to use it to its full potential. Does that address?
Yeah, I think that's exactly because a lot of tools you are applying, such as like fluid dynamic, the parametric tools, photogrammetry, I think these are also how architects or what we are doing in the studio are trying to perceive the environment, try to understand how we can start designing things from something intangible, right? And then I think from some of the work you're presenting, exactly because the availability of the tools, your workflow is becoming something very instrumental. As you are saying, like, because of the open source research method, each of us are able to kind of apply the similar investigation following the workflow. Like you were mentioning, for the machine learning, you have all the codes on the GitHub where people can, free to download and use. Another question is like, for the work from forensic architecture, are you looking at, in terms of evidence, in terms of, let's say, public engagement by creating this sort of storytelling, or engage with the discipline of architecture by providing an instrumental workflow? Like, what are the more, let's say, relative intention, or how you see your work is reflecting to these different aspects?
No, I mean, it's right. I think that we're trying to have a different kind of intervention in the different fields and in the different forums that we engage with. Let me start somewhere, just a bit early. All the tools that we're using have dark history to themselves. Even satellite images are kind of product of Cold War imperialism, and state surveillance. Machine learning is its all kind of, pile of trouble in itself. We're using game engines, Unreal and Unity, what gamers kind of use for designing games that make, youth addicted, especially in the, people with less privileged people. So I think that every time you use a technology, you probably want to do two things. You want to use technology to do something better with it than what, sort of all sort of corporation do in making people addicted, or, social media, big sort of social media giants or satellite companies, etc. So you want to turn it around. But you also want to introspect these technologies and the history of repression that exists within them through critical use. So I think that we try to do that. I don't know if we always succeed, but we try. If we use satellite images, we would use them, but we would also use our use of them, right, to ask different questions. Why is the pixelation like that? What is being hidden in the image? What is the politics of those images? Why are the pixels, again refer to, my neck of the wood. In Israel-Palestine, why is the pixelation bigger than in other places in the world? So you use in order to introspect that technology. When we use machine learning, we also try, because when you use synthetic classifiers, you have a very clear input and output. Now, we don't know what's happening in a black box. The algorithm is a black box for us. But when you have clear input and output, you can identify, you can start bringing in variations into the algorithm and see the variations in the output, and you can shed some light into that black box. So you use machine learning to shed some light on the world, and you use the use of machine learning to investigate human rights violation inside the algorithm itself. I think this is something we need to aspire to. It's difficult, it's just easier to say than to do, but it's something that we need to aspire to. Beyond that, I would say that every field that you operate in it, you need to operate critically. If you, and we learn, we learn through failing and through being stupid. You cannot simply take the gallery and the art world as an alternative place outside of conflict. The conflict ruptures the museums. They're part of the system, whether a system of domination or the kind of economic system of patronage that exists within corporate economy. That is, so it's not enough to just criticize other things in a museum. We need to fight against it, and we've done it several times, not only with Triple Chaser. We've done it recently in Manchester, where we closed the show, and in other places. If you present something in court, you need to use the court as a good political tool, but you need to question the problem, what you cannot, and you need to make sure people understand what cannot be said in courts. And courts sometimes are used to as colonial tools. So the law is not a kind of, again, a neutral sort of ground. It is written by a particular state to achieve particular aims. And again, in Israel, when one enters into court, you do a huge concession because you actually give certain credibility to a legal system. When you work in the media, it's also, we need to, on the one hand, I like our work being in the media because we arrive at big publics. On the other hand, I don't like the way in which the big media conglomerates still dominate the distribution of news. I much like better organizations that operate smaller, produce their own content, arrive online, and maybe, through the force of social media get amplified. So, I think that each one of the places, and so for art, so for architecture, we use architectural tools, but we have something to say back to architecture, right? We need to say, what is your complicity? Where's your privileges? Or what is our privilege? How are we organizing labor in our organization? How are we organizing? Who are the people that come to work with us? Why they come from particular, privileged background? How do we undo that? So, you need to always feel discontent. You have a constant, you never show the work as a kind of like, here is the answer to anything. You just need to understand you're always operating in an imperfect system. You're always needing to fight the ground in each one of the fields that you operate in. And as this group is architectural, I would say, yes, we have a lot of beef with architecture or with architects, the way the scene is organized now, in which so much of the energy, intellectual and technological is also intellectual energy, is invested into things that I think are completely misguided.
Then maybe next question or next thoughts I have is related to the Sliver lecture topic about the research. In your practice and in your teaching experience, you are doing the research. You are doing multidisciplinary research, right? So I'm curious, like, what kind of research? How you bring people together from different disciplines? Like in Hollywood, there's this kind of Hollywood mode where people that specialize in very specific things, super high tech, with someone is, camera crew, makeup crew, staging crew, and then when they have a gig, and then everyone gather together to work this out. And the other method is how we are engaging with advanced technologies in our architecture studio. For example, if we are teaching, particle simulation, if we are teaching a pedestrian simulation, we engage these softwares or experts, but try to hack the software or try to twist the workflow so that it really fits with our intention. And that's a very different way from the engineering side to think about the problem, because they always think from bottom up. They always think, how can I start to build up the system from the bottom? But the privilege for architects is that we can start to look at the problem from top down. We see the environment, we see the investigation point, we see the building and surrounding, and then we try to figure out, okay, how can we start to do a more specified investigation? And in this case, we need to kind of have the team engage with different technologies, but by hacking them in a very specific way. So I'm just wondering, like, in your practice and in your teaching experience, like, have you engaged with both modes of multidisciplinary research, and how are they working?
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating, and I'm very connected to what you're saying about hacking the particular software, particular system, or building the kind of bricolage of different, existing thing, but just like lined up in a different way. I think it's right. I think that there is, in principle, nothing new about different disciplines working together. We always say interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, as if it's, it's still, this word still have a kind of a ring, as if you say something amazingly great new. I think that's how things get built, from a cathedral to a rocket to a building. That's not the problem. The problem is how, and in architecture, of course, you're an architect, so you have the acoustic and the air conditioning and all your static expertise and things that are maybe more humanity based on, whatever they are. Doesn't matter. I think that, again, what one needs to aspire to is a non-directed encounter between different forms of expertise and a redefinition of what expertise is. So when you investigate state crimes or human rights violation, the most important expertise is experience, situated experience, embedded experience, perspectival view onto a situation rather than a kind of a top-down view. And the care it takes to build systems need to be through negotiation rather than through direction. Now again, every project has its own time frame and its own limitations. Sometimes the aspiration doesn't really work, but there is a lot of thought that we're giving to how an encounter is managed, how learning and co-learning is taking place, how building together is a system of mutual care between different people whose different expertise are not hierarchically organized, but woven together simply from different directions. That is to say, it's not like architecture in which you're the architect and your job is basically to synthesize different expertise that come in. It's more like an encounter. And indeed, every investigation is the construction of a community of practice rather than a multidisciplinary team answering to the top. It's a community of practice that includes primarily those people at the forefront, those people that experience violence firsthand, and those people that lead the struggle. And then it has, you know, people working in solidarity with them, activists, and then it has all sort of like art historians and fluid dynamic. How do you put those together, no? And, you know, a curator and a satellite image analyst. And somehow it has to weave in a way that creates something that we call open verification as a system that does not claim the truth as a transcendent thing, as a, you know, veritas and verification come from the same root, no? And veritas, is a transcendent conception. It's something that's more suitable to a rabbi or a priest, or I don't know, that know it all from a particular perspective. Whereas verification is immanent, is truth as a practice, not as a precondition. It's something that is built, is something that is continuously made and unmade, and can shift as new evidence come about, and includes multiple perspectives in it.